Hello, Pastor. I want to talk to you about the need to integrate your congregation to form a more balanced, more whole congregation. In other words, you need to learn and have your church integrated in concerning age. You don't want to have too many young, too many old. You want to integrate your church with various races, provided the various races are in your city. You want to integrate your church with both men and women so that it's not just heavily toward women and very few men. I want to talk about integrating your church economically so that you have rich and poor and middle class in the congregation. And see, integration is so important because what happens when you don't integrate your church and you become one-sided, you will actually hurt your own people because your people will not see the full spectrum of God's perfect will in their life. There's a story here in 1 Kings chapter 12 about Rio Boehm. He didn't have the wisdom as his father, and they were asking, what do we do? What kind of answer do we get concerning taxation? But it says in 1 Kings 12, verse 8, but Rehoboam rejected the advice that the elders gave him and consulted the young men who had grown up with him and were serving him. You see, Rehoboam just wanted to hang around young people like himself, people he grew up. And what I've noticed is a church has a tendency, because human beings by nature have a tendency to gravitate toward people like themselves. So whites have a tendency to gravitate toward other whites, blacks toward blacks, Hispanics toward Hispanics, Asians toward Asians. And even when it comes to age, young Christians have a tendency to try to find a church that has a bunch of young people like themselves. And this is a real mistake. When John had a vision of heaven, he said, I saw people from every nation, tribe, and language. I saw slaves and free people. I saw all sorts of people. And a local congregation should try to integrate so that it becomes a representative of the city that they're in, the town that they're in. But as a pastor, you actually have to intentionally try to integrate your church. You do that by preaching it, by explaining it, by also trying to incorporate various peoples in leadership position. And this is important. You say to me, why should I do this? Because if you don't do this, then you're going to lack some of the gifts that God has for you. You'll also lack wisdom, just as Rehoboam lacked wisdom, because what happens is if you're only with your type of people, then what's going to happen is you're not going to see the full picture that God has for you because you have a tendency to listen to only one side. That's not healthy at all for you as a pastor, and it's not healthy for your congregation to only hear this. See, here's what I've noticed. I'll see, for example, a church that reaches out toward gang members, drug addicts, prostitutes, and a lot of the congregation is just filled with a bunch of ex-addicts, some of them still addicts. And if those people who get saved do not eventually integrate, or that church doesn't integrate by bringing other people that don't have those life experiences, then what happens? The people will shortchange themselves, and I'll find that those drug addicts, those prostitutes, they will end up getting more tempted to go back to that. At first, they find it exhilarating to find people like themselves that got free, but unless they integrate, then you know what? They will shortchange themselves. That's why a church has to intentionally integrate on purpose for the benefit of the people and for the benefit of really your own wisdom. I'll give you an example. For example, I've been to many black churches. I love them. And I went to one particular very large one, and I noticed they happen to be so liberal on certain things, and I thought, where does this come from? Because I don't see the scriptures in that same way or the emphasis that they were making. But there's a reason. Because in the black churches, they've experienced certain prejudices, racism, and it has a tendency to taint the way they look at the Bible, and they have a tendency to see one side of the story rather than seeing the other side. On the other hand, I've been into just all white churches, and they don't seem to have a heart for some of the things that our black brothers are facing. So they have a tendency to see the Bible and see certain issues that they want to emphasize. But when we come together, then what do? We find that the Word of God speaks to all the issues, and we develop a more holistic and more balanced approach in the Word of God. And I've seen this mistake made constantly. Same thing can happen in economic issues. If a church is made up of primarily of low-educated, poor people, they have a tendency to see things in the Bible and emphasize things that they relate to. On the other hand, if a church has a lot of high, upper middle class, wealthy people, then they have a tendency to read the Bible in their culture. But when you integrate, you have a tendency to see the scriptures in its fullness rather than just in its partiality. This is why, for the sake of your own congregation, and pastor, even for your sake, it's important to integrate. And how do you do it? You have to intentionally do it. It's not going to happen by osmosis, you wishing for it. You as a leader have to cultivate it, and you have to start seeking people. I'll give you an example. In my church, we're really, El Paso is made up of 70% Hispanic, maybe 20% whites, and the rest blacks, Asians, and other ethnic backgrounds. Our congregation, fortunately, represents all that. However, it doesn't mean that our church represents that in leadership. So I recognize we need to get younger people involved in leadership. We have the various races in leadership, but not the age in leadership. So I'm actually cultivating that, trying to reach out to make that happen. So as a pastor, you can't just simply sit back and hope that it integrates. As a leader, you have to go out on purpose to try to make that happen. And this is true when it comes to economics or gender. You can't have a church of just a lot of women leaders. You got to bring men so they'll feel a part of the leadership, and vice versa. You can't just have all male leadership and don't respect the voices of the women of the church. See, and so God has called us to integrate. Again, it is the sinful nature of man, of the human race, that wants to just gravitate toward people like themselves. The headbangers want to go with them. The young people want to go to their church. The old people want to go to their church. The blacks, whites, Hispanics, Asians, they want to go to their churches. And I'm saying that's not right. And now, as a member of a congregation, you can't purposely just try to go to people like yourself. That's not healthy either. That's Solomon's mistake. Jeroboam's mistake versus Solomon's wisdom. Solomon had a lot of wisdom. He didn't make that mistake, but his son made that mistake. I encourage you, pastor, to do your best to intentionally integrate your congregation for the sake of getting more gifts, seeing a more balanced and holistic approach to the Word of God, and you're going to start to see greater manifestations of God's goodness in your life. I trust that this word